Hey, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to look at bitterness and anger. If you want to turn in your Bibles with me, we're going to look at three passages here to start with. It's going to kind of be what we build our foundation off of this afternoon as we talk about anger and helping someone resolve anger, work through anger. Start with Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26. Says, "Be angry and sin not, let not the sun go down upon your wrath." And so one of the concepts that we learn from this verse is that the feeling of anger isn't necessarily wrong. As it says here, we're to be angry but don't sin. The problem is that we oftentimes, most times, our anger becomes sinful. We like to think that we have righteous indignation, as the Bible calls it, but oftentimes our anger is not that. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. We'll come back to the second part of that verse later on. Let's turn to James chapter 1 and verse 20 is another place that the Bible talks about anger. It says, "For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." So in the selfishness of my anger, that doesn't produce the righteousness of God. That's another foundational key point that we'll talk about as we go along. The next verse is found in James chapter 4 and verse 8. "Draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded." And so that speaks of, in dealing with anger, there's two aspects that we deal with, is our behavior and our heart. And there's parts of it that I can deal with my behavior, but it really encourages, I think, in order to get lasting change, we have to deal with my heart. And we'll talk about that. So just some concepts from the Bible that I wanted to point out. I'm going to begin with a story that happened to me just a couple of weeks ago that involves anger. And I serve on our local volunteer township fire department, and we got paged to a vehicle accident, and there's 3 vehicles and no minor injuries. There was people needed to go to the hospital, but nobody had any major injuries. But one of the drivers was very angry, and I probably in my lifetime haven't seen anything quite like it. But anyway, so he gets out. He's out of the vehicle, walking around. He's holding his head, and I didn't really think about it. The ambulance crew was talking to him, and we were doing other things there that we needed to do. And the next thing I know, he just starts yelling real loud. And he walked right out in the middle of the highway, and the sheriff's deputies there grabbed him and said, "Hey, you can't walk out there, you're going to get hit." So he came back over to the vehicle and stood there for a little bit, and then he just backed up and started kicking his car. And I don't think he could have did much. It was already, the front end was smashed in, and I don't think he could have did much more to it, but he started kicking it. And about that time, his father showed up on the scene, and they got into a shouting match between the two of them. And so us firefighters, we just kind of stood, we just took a step back. Our fire chief said, "Hey, everybody just take a step back." And so we all just took a step back. And so the sheriff's department guys were trying to sort this out. So they kind of got him calmed down. He's still walking around the vehicle. And after a bit, he just goes up to the vehicle and just takes his head and just pounds his head and just hits his head on the car several times. I was just like, what in the world? And so very angry. There's another man there. The opposite driver was a black man, and I never got to talk to him, but I suppose he was a Christian, because he came over right away to this fellow, and he said, I heard him telling him, he said, "Look, my car's replaceable. It's no problem at all between us." And very calm. He didn't act like he even had a loss. And so I saw the two opposite people there in that. But that's probably an extreme version of our anger, what anger will do and how it can be expressed. Anger is an emotion that we feel. Yeah, we have lots of them. Anger is the same emotion as we can feel happiness, we can feel sadness. Anger is another one of those. It's one of the ways we're created like God. We can look at Psalms chapter 7 and verse 11. I'll just turn to that quickly. God judges the righteous, and God is angry with the wicked every day. So God feels also. He feels anger too. Our emotions act as reflectors. They reflect our deep feelings about what is going on around us. And let me illustrate it like this. So if you were driving your car down the road and the temperature gauge went up, it got hot. Let's just say it went up you noticed it's going up, it gets hot. So that is telling me what? What would you guess that's saying to you? Somebody tell me. If temperature gauge of your car went up, that says what? It's overheating. Okay. So to solve that, would you just stop, grab a hammer, beat the gauge out, keep going, right? That'd be a good solution, wouldn't it? You wouldn't see the gauge anymore, it'd be going. No, that's not a good solution. So we'd want to check for a deeper problem, right? It's saying there's a problem. Maybe radiator hose has a leak. Maybe my water pump has a leak. So it causes me so that gauge is a reflector of something deeper. And that's the same way with our feelings of anger reflect something about my heart. And as we go along here, I'm hoping my goal is that we can look at biblical truth and learn to search our heart. How can we go back and search our heart and find the source? And that's key in helping someone overcome anger, or even overcoming it in my own life. Okay, our other point here is point number 3. Anger is a whole person response to perceived offenses. And so when I say that, I mentioned this yesterday, a whole person means it involves my thinking, my feelings, my choice, and my body. And so think of it this way. I maybe perceive that somebody has taken advantage of me. So that's a thought that comes in my mind, a perception. Right away, I have feelings about that, right? And so my feelings come, and then I decide, I make a choice. And we may do it subconsciously, and the more we do it subconsciously, the more it becomes a habit. And I know in working with counselees with an anger problem, they say, well, I didn't even think about it. That's something I didn't even think. And it's out of my heart, it's subconsciously, I make choices and I respond. And it even then the anger would come out in my body, and such as I get red in the face, blood pressure goes up, tension. So that's kind of the sequence, or that's what it means by a whole person response. Okay, I drew a little diagram. It's in your book here too. Kind of explain this. And our emotions are to be under the lordship of Christ as a believer. And so you can see in the box there, I have them under the lordship of Christ. And it could be, I have some mentioned over there on the left, or in your book here, it's probably underneath them there. Several A, B, C, D, and E. One may be to have control. Another may be being recognized, having worth, being loved or belonging, to be served. These may be all desires that I have, which maybe in of themselves there's nothing wrong with. but as long as I keep them under the lordship of Christ. When they come out from under the lordship of Christ, then they become a demand. And so I'll just give you an experience of myself that I had to stop and just ponder and think and actually talk to myself a little bit about this. But on Monday, we were preparing for the seminar, and Deeper Life was going to get here at 4 o'clock, and Merle and Paul and Kevin and I had kind of talked about last minute things, and we also talked about, we had some last minute registrations and kind of thinking about our book number, and thought maybe we ought to just print 20 more books. So a local guy there had printed books for us, so I decided I'm going to run over there and pick up some more. And I knew I needed to be here at 4 o'clock, so I started across town, and sure enough, what do you think happens? The first person I get behind is driving slow, and I'm driving along, and boy, all of a sudden I start to get tense, and I can just feel it welling up. It's just coming, and so I was thinking, now, Brian, what are you doing here? I just had to stop and think, now, what is going on here? And I just had to rest. I had to tell myself, okay, it's all right. We're going to get the books. It'll be on time. Dave and Ben aren't going to think I'm late if I show up late. It's all those thoughts go through your mind. So what would have happened if I would make that a demand? So if I driving across town, I'm following this slow person, and I need to get there on time. I need to get back over here to the church and meet Fresh Start or meet Deeper Life at 4 o'clock. And I make that a demand, what would happen? What could be some of the things I would do that would be sinful? Lean on the horn, okay. That'd be one, all right. Yep, that'd be one. Okay, yep, that'd be another one. Yep. Tailgate, okay, yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, okay. Attitude of revenge. Okay. Very good. So yeah, you see how it works. And I think all of us experience those things. That's real live. That's where we live on an everyday basis. So in having my desires under the lordship of Christ, that's what I'm trying to illustrate here with that little diagram. A desire equals I want, and there's nothing wrong with that at that stage. Then if it becomes a demand, it becomes I must. And then if it goes from a demand to a need, it goes to I will. And then when it goes from a need to an expectation, it comes to you should. So then I expect somebody else to. And then a disappointment means that you didn't. And then it equals punishment because you didn't, I will. That's a sinful route of response. And oftentimes anger follows that very route. So let me repeat that again. Desire equals I want. Demand equals I must. Need equals I will. Expectations equal you should. Disappointment equals you didn't. And punishment equals because you didn't, I will. And as we talked about yesterday in abuse, oftentimes abuse comes out of that last decision. Punishment because you didn't, I will. And I make somebody else pay, and it comes out in abuse. Come across a quote that says, desire much, pray for much, but demand nothing. To trust God means to demand nothing. Oh, let me get my PowerPoint caught up here. Okay. All right, back to our verse that we first mentioned here in James, where it says that we're to be angry and sin not. It gives the connotation that there is an anger that can be right. And one of the people who are able to do that is God. And it does, I could take you to scriptures and show you a few examples of where obviously Jesus was an example of righteous anger. As I thought about my own life, I don't think, I don't know, very, very little, very few times probably was my anger righteous. Righteous anger responds to actual sin. Righteous anger focuses on God and his kingdom principles, and that's a point that usually when I'm angry, I'm focused on my problem, my need, what I want, or what I think I deserve, or, on Monday I needed to get to a certain place and I thought I had the right to get there at a certain time, and somebody was in front of me blocking that. Righteous anger expresses itself in godly, self-controlled ways. And I thought about, what would be an example of where we may experience righteous anger. And I thought about it. So if you were driving down the street, let's just say in our city of Washington here, and you saw somebody on the sidewalk beating a child, that would make you angry, right? I think everybody here would have angry feelings about that. So what would you do? Even if you stopped, what would be a righteous approach? I think to go over and try to protect the child. I wouldn't want to, righteous anger wouldn't retaliate against the person doing the beating, but to protect the child, that anger in me would cause me to do something right. I come across another quote here. Anger is not designed to stimulate us to do destructive things to our neighbors. Anger's fundamental purpose is to motivate us to positive action that will leave things better than we found them. That's by Gary Chapman. Anger is not designed to stimulate us to do destructive things to our neighbor. Anger's fundamental purpose is to motivate us to positive action that will leave things better than we found them. So there is righteous anger. There is. The Bible says there is. I think it's rare because of our selfish, fallen nature. Okay, number 6, we have destructive anger. Anger can become destructive when we fail to express them in harmony with the biblical limitation and structure. And 2 ways that we do that is either we ventilate or blow up, or we internalize and clam up. Probably the two ways. Proverbs 29:11 says, "A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it till afterwards." And in our culture today, one of the ways that rather than deal with the heart, you just vent it. And I was told recently, and I just actually researched this for this topic, but there is actually places, and it's in this state, it's called a rage room, where you can go and pay for a 20-minute session, an hour session, whatever you want, and you're allowed to bring your own objects. They supply the weapons, but you can go in a room and demolish whatever you brought. You're allowed to do that, but you cannot. They won't allow you to bring your own weapons. They supply the weapons, but you can bring any object you want. That's an actual, I looked up their website, and I could have set it up and went there if I'd have wanted to. So it's an actual place called a rage room. Also in that same place, they have a room that you can paint, and you can go in there and daub paint on the wall to your heart's content, any color you want, whatever you want to do. And I was trying to see what it cost, but I couldn't do that. They wouldn't show you the cost till you actually signed up, so I didn't do that. But it's just a faulty way of dealing with our anger. And the gentleman out there at the accident, that's what he was doing, right? He was venting his anger. And I don't know all the situation behind his story. I don't know all that. Obviously, he had a real problem, and I think his dad knew that. And his dad was not angry. His dad was trying to talk sense into him. And I think his dad had dealt with him before and knew that you had to get right up in his face and talk to him real straight for him to shape up. And that's what he was doing. And so, yeah. he also at one point punched the car. I mean, he punched it multiple times on the windows, and yeah, what he thought he was going to do. And so for some of us, it's easy for us to vent. Others of us turn our anger inward. We internalize it. And Ephesians 4:27 says, or the verse I read, 26 actually, be angry and sin not, but let not the sun go down upon your wrath. I think that's why the scripture says that. It's for those of us that internalize it, we're supposed to deal with it by the end of the day. We don't let it keep stirring and stirring. It says, let not the sun go down on your wrath. It says, neither give place to the devil. And you know, the longer I keep it going, replaying it, the more it becomes a place for the devil to work. And so I feel like the Bible addresses both of those. My wife and I are different in this way. She expresses her feelings, and she by no way expresses it in rage, but she's probably more so to talk about it. I'm probably more so to just be quiet and go on. And she tells me constantly, she said, the only difference between the two is that yours looks better than mine. She tells me that. I said, that's probably true. Okay, evaluating anger. I thought about this yesterday when Ben had his matches up there. Come across this little saying here that kind of helps us understand the progression. So reacting to hurts is like lighting a match. Rehearsing them is starting a fire. And then reporting or talking about it to others feeds the fire. And then when I actually reject the offender, I fuel the inferno. It's kind of a progression. Okay, let's look at some characteristics of the spirit of bitterness. We've been talking about anger, and in my studies, it's kind of hard to separate bitterness and anger. But as I studied, it seems to me like that bitterness is an anger that settles in for long term, that I have left take root in my heart and settle in for long term. You know, if you turn to Hebrews 12, chapter 15, or verse 15. Some interesting things the Bible says about bitterness. Hebrews 12, 15. Looking diligently, lest any man fail the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. And some versions would use, for failing the grace of God, would use coming short of the grace of God. But it has a connotation of selling the grace of God cheap. So when I allow bitterness in my life and other people see that, I'm really disrespecting the grace of God in my life. I've not allowed God to work. That was a new truth to me as I studied. Also, bitterness leaves a mark. It says here, lest it defile many. And also, it troubles me, or me, the person that's carrying it. It mentions that too, springing up trouble you. Bitterness brings about trouble in my life. Some of the characteristics of spirit of bitterness would be justification, that a little anger is permissible, insensitive to the hurts caused by anger. And so a person who is bitter oftentimes doesn't even realize the damage that they're doing with their anger. Insensitive to the hurts. Belief that anger can be controlled. So they don't want to admit they're angry because they feel like they can control it. So there's no need to do anything about it. Attitude of domination or know-it-all. Quick to take up offenses for others. As soon as they see a person that's been treated like them, they right away take up an offense for that person. Argumentative attitude. inability to forgive or receive forgiveness. Harsh attitudes on the outside, but sensitive feelings on the inside. And you see that come out in, they build this image of being a tough person on the outside, but on the inside, they're very sensitive. Okay, some visible evidences of anger that we'd see: being irritable, just hard to get along with, doesn't take much to make me irritated. Impatient, we maybe go along the same way, similar. Raised and loud voice, glaring eyes, hurtful words. A lot of times our anger comes out in things that we say, comes out in our words. Explosive actions, throwing things, kicking or hitting, yelling or screaming in rage. The opposite, maybe on the opposite extreme of that, would be a closed off spirit, where I just withdraw and isolate myself. Attitude of spirit superiority. Tension. We've all been in those situations where maybe there's conflict, but you walk in the room, you feel like you could cut the air with a knife. Just the tension that's there comes along with anger. Control tactics, saying or doing nice things for people in order to obligate them to be nice in return or take my side. Securing friendships to obligate their trust so they don't befriend the one I'm bitter at. Hinting that something is wrong but not being open and specific. Be some evidences of anger and bitterness. What are some causes of anger that could be things that happen that could bring anger? Past abuse. We talked about several of those yesterday. Situations that may arise. Dysfunctional family, angry parents, abandonment. B would be, we get caught up here. Unmet needs, disappointed expectations, perceived denial of rights. And we went through that progression. Work demands, can be the pressure of a job. That has a way of putting pressure on my life and brings about feelings. Maybe of being taken advantage of, or things that I wish were different that are not. I think somebody else should be doing that. Be a lot of aspects of that. Parenting challenges. I think we've all experienced that as a parent. I remember we had 4 boys before we had a girl, but when the boys were growing up, going through the times they were 2, and we called them the terrible 2s, but I recall one night coming home from work, and I don't even remember which one of our boys it was anymore. It was up crawling around, but Breen was trying to get supper ready, and he had taken all the pans out of the one cabinet in the kitchen, and he was sitting in there. Things like that, when it can raise pressure, it can be frustrating. Traffic, I mentioned that, my own experience with traffic. In-law, family relationships could be another one. Social media lies. This is one I didn't think about much, but my wife and I have talked about it. People on social media paint an image that is not. The image that you see is always perfection and everything's fine and good, and it paints a picture, and it's easy for us to think, well, why is my life not like that? Why don't things go like that for me? Start comparing. That can be a factor. Disease, injuries, imbalanced hormones, illegal drugs, fatigue, poor nutrition. Someone who's dealing already with an anger problem and intoxicate them on top of that only expands it, or be under the the influence of drugs only expands the anger problem. Okay, so that kind of gives us an overview of anger, kind of biblical perspective of what the Bible sees about anger. Let's look at some ways to overcome anger. I have 4 categories. We're going to spend quite a bit of time here on all 4 of them. Some concepts, and then I have a chart there we'll go over, the chart that I use, and we'll go over that. So the first, overcoming sinful anger, the first step is faith. And some of you may be asking, well, how is faith a step to overcome anger? Hebrews 11:6 says that without faith it's impossible to please God. And so overcoming anger requires me to trust God. God calls us to trust Him in situations where we naturally would feel angry. And some of the maybe we would say theology in that is that God is. He's here today. He's present everywhere. And we could argue that, if we had I'm trying to think of an example here, but if you had a big rock in your yard and you could sit in the house and say, well, it's not out there. You could close the blinds and shut the windows and just so you couldn't see it, but it wouldn't change the fact that it was there. And I think that's God is here and He's everywhere. God is sovereign and He is in total control of everything. And God also gives us a free choice. So He does allow us to make choices. We talked about that yesterday. Abuse is somebody who misuses their ability to choose in a wrong way, to mistreat someone else. God does put limitations on the power of choice. So an example of that would be in Job, where Satan came along and said, he wants to do this to Job, and God told him, you can do so much, but you don't take his life. That's the limitation God put on Satan. So we do have limitations on our choices. There are some powers we don't have, things that we can't change, even though we have choice. God holds me accountable for my choices. So I can make choices, but there's a price comes along with that. So going back to my traffic incident on Monday, so if I would have made a bad choice and swung out to pass the person and had an accident, it was my fault, there would have been some consequences went along with that. I would have experienced some consequences for my choice. One thing we need to consider as we ponder and look at our hearts in anger is God has eternal purposes for me and for each one of us. And by allowing God to control my life and resting in Him rather than being angry is a step of faith. It is me trusting God. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. Faith grows out of studying Scripture. Faith also grows out of expressing my faith. And so I thought about that. It's easy for us to express our anger. We can express that. We naturally express that in ways. But what are ways we express our faith? And as Hebrews 12, the verse there in Hebrews said, we allow a root of bitterness to spring up. It actually sells the grace of God. It presents the grace of God as being short. So how can I, as I live trusting God, accepting what He brings into my life, accepting the circumstances, learn from them, that exalts God's grace in my life. Overcoming anger by trusting God with the situation or person that makes me angry and responding the way God calls me to is expressing our faith. And so to stop and consider when I feel angry, why? What's making me angry, and how does God want me to respond? How could I express my faith in God right in this circumstance? When we express anger, we are confirming in our heart that our anger is right. When we express our faith by trusting God, we also confirm and strengthen our faith. So a person who continues to vent their anger, it usually progresses worse and worse. I'm sure the fellow out there at the accident, that probably wasn't the first time he did that. And who knows what he would do in private if he's willing to do that in public where there's 20 people watching. What would he do if he was by himself? But the same thing works as I express my faith, as I am able to recognize God's work in a situation that makes me angry and express my faith. It grows, it strengthens. So overcoming sinful anger, the one step is faith, us having faith and expressing our faith in God and trust. Number 2 is forgiveness. Luke 17, verse 15. I'll just read that verse. I'm not sure. I might have down the wrong verse there. Sure, it's not that one. Anyway, the Bible talks much about forgiveness. The verse I was looking for is when Jesus taught his disciples about forgiveness, and they said right away that after Jesus was done teaching them about forgiveness, and he even mentioned about forgiving 70 times 7, and anybody here know what was the statement the disciples made to Jesus? Anybody remember what that was? Increase our faith. So they recognized that Jesus' disciples recognized that it takes faith to forgive. That is a step that requires faith. Everyone's called to forgive. Each one of us are called to forgiveness. Forgiveness is for wrongs. Forgiveness does not mean denial. And so some faulty concepts of forgiveness would be that if I forgive, then that means it didn't happen. No, that's not true. Forgiveness does not require that I forget. And that's a common one, that I need to forget. And that is not true either. Forgiveness does not require that I forget. Some of the things I've had to practice forgiveness in my life, I didn't forget. But God does heal those feelings where I can talk about that today and it doesn't even stir any feelings in me. I think God, that's the grace of God. I can't do that myself. That's the work of God in each of our lives. Forgiveness requires self-denial. So forgiveness requires practicing what I don't feel like doing. Forgiveness requires cleaning out my closet of hurts. And forgiveness brings honor and glory to God, ultimately exalts Christ and God in our lives. The whole subject of forgiveness could be a whole topic on itself. But it is part of, oftentimes, anger comes out of mishurts, mistreatment, and it requires forgiveness. So that's a step in overcoming anger. Okay, love is the next one. And so back to our emotions being a reflector, and how can and also anger being a motivator, motivates me to do right. How can my anger motivate me to love? Question we can ponder. I think of a few years back on a Saturday morning at Fresh Start, was house parent then, and came out of in the morning, came outside, and I noticed at the back of our building, water was running down the driveway, probably 6 inches deep. And I thought, something's not right with that. So I walked out to the street, and here, coming out of the pavement, was a well of water. And so obviously we had a water leak in the city water system. So I called utilities, and they said they'll send somebody out. So pretty soon, supervisor came out and looked at it, and he's like, well, we're going to have to dig that up and fix it. So crew came out a little bit later, and so they dug a hole in the street and exposed the line, and there was a crew there, probably, I think it was 4 guys maybe, working, and there was an older guy, and the younger boy there in his mid-20s, he called him Pap. So I don't know what his real name was, but that's what he called him, so that's what I'm going to call him today, Pap. And so we were standing there, I was standing there, and the mayor had come out and brought donuts out for them, and so he was talking to all of us, and we were standing there. So Pap got a ladder, and he went down in the hole to repair the water line, whatever it was. And I mean, in a little bit, after a bit, up out of the hole come a wrench, and next thing something else flew up out of the hole, and I'll never forget it. The boy that was standing here, in the mid-20s, he was standing there watching. He just looked around the rest of us. He said, I think Pap needs a hug. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good observation of that all. And so, and he promptly did that. When Pap came up out of the hole, he gave him a hug. But I guess them two worked together. He knew him. I guess that must not have been the first time that happened. But I wasn't paying attention enough to know that what went on down the hole was frustrating for Pap, and he was getting done. So, but that young man had a concept. He was going to show love. He wasn't going to allow that incident he wasn't going to fight back. Love is a God-ordained response to those who our natural response would be to be angry at. And Matthew 5, some interesting things here in these verses, how Jesus addressed certain areas, and I feel like he did a very good job at covering all of them. Matthew 5, verses 43 and 44. It says, you have heard it's been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. So it mentions loving our enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And so Jesus covered all the ways that somebody can hurt me. And so I'm called to love those who are my enemy, or those who work against me, or that I feel like are opposed to me. Those that curse you, God calls us to bless them. So those who would say nasty things about me, gossip about me, whatever you want to put into words, God calls me to bless them with my mouth. And also those that hate me, God calls me to do good. Those who would have ill will toward me, unforgiveness, dislike, I'm to find ways to practically do good deeds for them. And those that despitefully use you, God calls us to pray for them. Those that find pleasure in causing you pain. And maybe sometimes in those circumstances, we don't have a choice. We can't stop it. Maybe it's somebody in authority. The only thing I can do is pray for them. And helping others in my own life, I've been challenged already too in this same area. And for a long time I thought, well, so if I forgive somebody, if I've prayed and forgave them, then it doesn't matter if I can just stay away from them and we're good to go. But I think God calls us to another step, and that is to follow these things in doing good. And I was working through a forgiveness situation in my own life, and I had a man I was talking with about it, and he really challenged me on, so I felt I did the first part. But he said, Brian, you haven't done the second part yet of these verses. And you know what? In all reality, the second part was harder to do than the first in the actual doing good. But I found also that when I was willing to take that second step, I found a whole lot more peace than I did in just taking half the step, the first one. And so it is true that God's ways work, and we need to follow them in forgiveness. So when you're working with somebody with anger, to walk them through the forgiveness process and help them take these steps. Love responses keep us from becoming like our enemies, and love responses will quicken our own healing. And I've experienced that in my own life. Okay, attitude of gratitude is another one. And how many times in any of these sessions have we came across this one? Thankful and gratitude is a step that God requires in trusting Him. So what in my life is a blessing? A lot of times when I'm angry because I don't feel like everybody else has it better than me, or I don't have this, somebody else has it, or God's not done this for me, but He does it for somebody else. Kind of that mentality. And so how can we take steps to be grateful? Sometimes you have to take practical steps in helping a person who's dealing with anger to look at what they have to be thankful for. What in their life is a blessing. And then I think God even calls us to take a higher step than that, is to be able to come to the place where I can thank God for the things that make me angry, or the people that make me angry. I can actually thank Him for that. And that's a process to get there. Okay, I put in here a little chart that I use oftentimes. This is a practical step that you can use in helping somebody. Let me back up here to the questions first. What are some questions that we can ask that expose the heart, or ways that we can help somebody look at their heart? So to just stop and think about the situation that made me angry. Who, what, where, or when? Just look at all those instances. Who was the person? What was the circumstances? This happened on the job, or where did it happen and when? Just to look at all that. Number 2 is what was said, what was did, who did what are some of the actions taken, and what did I feel? Take time to talk about that. Then beliefs and motives, what they thought. So what were some of the thoughts that I had when I was angry? What was I thinking? What were some of the thoughts? What were the desires that I wanted? What were they, to be able to identify some of those? What was I really wanting? So the case that I gave you the example of myself on Monday, so I was driving down the road, right? And this person in front of me is driving slow. That would be the situation. Behavior, what was said, did, or felt. I sure felt things. I felt the tension rising, and what was my desires? To get my books picked up and get back over here by 4 o'clock to meet Deeper Life. And deeper than that, what was it? Probably me wanting to look like I'm on time, maybe. To not look like I'm a failure, or I didn't get things done on time. That could have been some of it. Just to identify what I wanted. What are the things I wanted? And then number 4 would be, how would God have wanted me to respond differently? So even if I responded wrongly, to look at what could I have done in that situation that would have been different? the little chart there. There's some scripture verses there to go along, but temptations and sinful thoughts, or, when I have feelings of anger, have them chart them in that column. And then to look at what, and just their thoughts. What were they thinking? Like, I feel like somebody took advantage of me. I want to do this. I feel like doing this or this. Whatever sinful responses they would have thought about. Second line would be, what should I be thinking in this situation? So as I look these scriptures up here, what does the Bible teach me that I should do? What should I have been doing? How should I think about the situation? And over in the third column is, what should I be doing as a result of my new biblical thinking? So what's the right thing to do? How can I change my response? I included in your book a full sheet of that in the back. You're welcome to use that if you want to. Okay, so in helping those with anger, just maybe in a summary, our emotions are reflectors. And so they only reflect what we feel or what we think. And they reflect what's going on in my heart. To remember that and help the person connect to their heart desires, because that's where change needs to happen in order for behavior to change. And sometimes you might have to start with the behavior first till you work your way back to the heart, calling them to that. But in our world today, so much is focused on, anger management class. And that doesn't deal with the heart. That just teaches me to behave right. It doesn't really deal with my heart and the deep areas of my heart that the anger comes from. Thank you, and God bless each one of you.